the jealous neighbor. When we moved into that house, everything seemed perfect. It was a quiet street with well-kept houses, neighbors who greeted with smiles, and that feeling that we had made the right choice. It didn't take long to meet Carla, our neighbor from across the street. She was in her 30s, married, but her husband seemed to be always traveling. Carla was talkative, friendly, and at first she seemed to be always willing to help. My mother even said it was good to have someone like that around, since we were starting a new life there. Only that, over time, things were changing in a way that no one could have predicted. It all started with comments that, at the time, sounded like compliments but had something strange. Carla praised my mother for the house, always well-groomed, for the recipes she posted on social networks, but always ended with something like, "Oh, if I were so lucky," or "God knows some have everything and others nothing." At the time, my sister and I were teenagers, and she also made a point of commenting on our appearance, saying things like, "You guys pulled your dad, huh?" Because I would never have such beauty. It seemed harmless, but there was a tone, uncomfortable, as if it were not just admiration. My mother even said to ignore that it was her way. But soon it became clear that it was more than that. Things started to get really weird when my dad got a promotion at work, and we managed to renovate the house. They changed the old gate for a new one, painted the walls, and my mother even had a garden made in front of it, with flowers that she loved. It seemed that everything was going well for us, but that's when Carla changed completely. She began to avoid my mother, no longer answered the good morning as before, and when she spoke, it was always with that dry tone and full of resentment. One day, my mother casually commented to a neighbor who thought that Carla was not well, perhaps having problems in the marriage, and this neighbor said, "She has, but it is with whom she feels envy." From then on, small but strange things began to happen. Our dog, who had never been aggressive, began to growl at the front door every night, without apparent reason. My father thought he was getting old or with some health problem, but the vet said that everything was normal. Then my sister started having episodes of high fever, which appeared out of nowhere and disappeared as fast as they came. I had no explanation. The drop of water was when she fainted at school and had what doctors called seizure with no definite cause. I remember my mother crying next to her bed in the hospital, saying that something was wrong, that it wasn't normal. When we came back from the hospital, things only got worse. My father, who was always healthy, started complaining of strange pains in his back and shoulders. He said that he seemed to be carrying a weight that was not his. My mother started having disturbing dreams almost every night, and in the morning she was always exhausted, as if she had not slept at all. She never told me exactly what she saw in those dreams, but I remember her waking up several times screaming, saying that someone was trying to get in. That's when strange things started to appear in our yard. One morning, my mother found a dead chicken with precise cut marks near the fence that led to Carla's house. Again, there was a small cloth doll, full of pins, thrown near the newly renovated garden. My father said that they were just jokes of bad taste, but my mother was convinced that it had something to do with Carla. We decided to install security cameras, but strangely enough they stopped working the same week. The technician could not explain why they simply did not record anything at night, as if something was blocking the system. It was then that my mother decided to talk with an older lady in the neighborhood, Donna Lourdes, who was known for knowing things. Donna Lourdes was very direct. "Your neighbor messes with things she shouldn't, my daughter. Beware of her. These diseases, these signs, this is not just a coincidence. Remember that my mother came back from this pale conversation, holding a small branch of rue that Donna Lourdes had given her. She put it behind the door of the room, as if to protect the house, but that night her nightmares got even worse. That night was especially disturbing. My mother woke up screaming around 3 in the morning, and everyone in the house ran to her room. She was sweating, her eyes were wide, and all she could say was, "She was here. She was here." My father tried to calm her down, saying it was just another bad dream, but the way she looked at the door of the room made my heart cold. I went there to check, and it had nothing abnormal, but the feeling of being observed was almost palpable. I looked out the window, and I swear to God, I saw a shadow standing across the street, right in front of Carla's house. Could not distinguish what it was, but the way that it stood still, without moving, made me close the curtain at the time. The next day, my mother decided to clean the whole house with salt and holy water, something she had never done before. She said she needed to get the bad energy out. We thought it was too much, but let her do it. It was during the cleaning that I found something strange. Behind one of the plants in the garden, my mother found a black bag tied with string. Inside it had what seemed to be a mixture of earth, cut nails, and something that looked like hair. She threw it out immediately, but after that my sister had another seizure. This time it was at home, and I remember being completely desperate while my father called the emergency. It was as if it would never end, as if, no matter how hard we tried, something kept us stuck in a cycle of bad things. After this episode, my mother made a decision that seemed desperate. She called a priest to bless the house. The priest came on a Sunday afternoon, prayed in each room, and used holy water on doors and windows. While he did that, the mood in the house was heavy, as if the air were denser. When he arrived in the room where my mother had put the branch of rue behind the door, something strange happened. The branch, which was green and fresh the night before, looked dry and withered as if it had been burned from within. The priest just looked at it, made the sign of the cross, and continued to pray, but I saw the expression on his face. He was also uncomfortable. That night, everything was quiet. I had no dog growling, nor my mother's scary dreams. For a moment, we thought the worst was over. But around 2 in the morning, I woke up with a loud noise, as if something had fallen into the corridor. When I opened the door of my room, I saw my mother standing in the middle of the hall, staring at the front door. She was still, her arms dropped to the side of her body, and there was something wrong with her eyes. They were placed, empty. I called her, but she didn't answer. My father appeared just behind me, held her by the shoulders and tried to wake her, but she only murmured, "She will not stop. She will never stop." The next morning, my mother seemed exhausted, as if she had not slept a second at all, but insisted on living a normal life. Meanwhile, my father started thinking about selling the house. He was never to believe these things, but said that all this was affecting our health, and that perhaps it would be better to start elsewhere. Only that, before any plan, something even stranger happened. On his way to work, my father found the front gate with deep marks of risk, as if something had tried to force its way in during the night. He called the dog, thinking it was perhaps some animal, but the dog was scared, hidden in the corner of the yard, and did not stop shaking. It was on this day that we decided to avoid any contact with Carla. My mother stopped greeting her, and we avoided even looking at her house. But it seemed that the more we tried to get away, the more bizarre things happened. One afternoon, while I was studying in the room, I smelled a strange burning smell coming from outside. When I looked out the window, I saw a fine smoke coming up from the side of the garden. I ran to see what it was and found a small pile of ash, right where we found that strange little bag before. There was no fire or anything that would explain how it came about. My mother said she could not take it anymore, that she was sure that Carla was doing something against us. But my father insisted that everything was a coincidence, even if it was obvious that it wasn't. The situation reached its peak the next night. It was already midnight when we all went up awake by loud banging on the front door. My father was the first to get up, thinking it could be a neighbor needing help or maybe some problem with the gate again. When he opened the door, however, there was no one there. The street was deserted, but the dog was hallucinating, barking as if he saw something we cannot see. We closed the door, trying not to make any difference, but the beats began, this time stronger and faster. My father opened again, but again there was no one. The dog stopped barking, and this time he was paralyzed, staring at a fixed point in the garden. When we looked, we saw something that looked like a figure bent between the plants. My mother began to pray aloud, and I confess that I have never felt so much fear in my life. That figure, whatever it was, did not move, just stood there, motionless, as if it was information we were looking at. My father closed the door once and said to nobody to leave the house. The night seemed endless, but eventually things became silent. When the sun came up, we went out to check the garden, but there was no sign of anything, no footprints, nothing that explained what we saw. It was as if everything had disappeared with the night. That day, my father made the decision to put a house up for sale, even if it was at a lower price. He said it would not be worth risking our mental and physical health by staying there. But before we can announce, something even more disturbing happened. My mother went to the gate to see the plants and found, in the middle of the garden, a black ribbon wrapped around a branch. It was a common ribbon, one that would be used to wrap gifts, but there was something in it that seemed wrong. My mother did not even want to touch. She called my father, who cut the branch and threw everything in the trash. Still, the feeling of discomfort in the house or the rest of the day. When we finally moved in, months later, things started to get better. My sister had no more seizures, my mother stopped having nightmares, and even the dog returned to normal. But we never forget what we lived at home. To this day, sometimes my mother mentions Carla, saying that she believes she knew exactly what she was doing. The strangest of all is that, shortly after we moved, we learned from our neighbor that Carla and her husband had also left her house overnight, without notifying anyone. They didn't take furniture, nothing. They just disappeared. Even today, when I think of those months, I have a shiver in my spine. Do not know what really happened, if it was envy, some kind of negative energy, or something darker. What I know is that it all started and ended so suddenly that it seems like a bad dream. But it was not a dream. I lived it, and I never want to go through something like that again. The neighbor who never leaves home. I have been living in this neighborhood for a few years, and I always liked how quiet things are here. The houses are all alike, with well-kept gardens, and the neighbors are generally friendly. But there is one thing that always intrigues me, my neighbor in front. Don't know his name, I never saw him in person, and what strikes me is that he never leaves the house. Never. On garbage collection days, the bins appear on the curb as if by magic, and the mail packages disappear from the balcony without anyone opening the door. At night, the lights on the ground floor and second floor windows are off, but the attic is always on, without failing a single night since I moved. At first I thought it was strange, but over time I got used to it. I was just another expert in the neighborhood, or so I thought. Things have changed a few weeks ago. I was coming home from work late at night, and while parking the car, I heard a noise coming from the direction of his house. It was like a furniture drag, heavy but irregular, as if something very large was being pushed upstairs. At the time, I thought it might be some kind of renovation, but it was too late for that, and the sound seemed to come from the attic, the same place where the light was always on. When I entered the house, I tried to ignore it, but the noise continued for almost half an hour. It made me restless. I stood in the window for a while, looking at that light in the attic and wondering what he was doing up there every night. The next night, the noise came back, but this time it seemed even stranger. It wasn't just the sound of something being dragged. It had a kind of intermittent style, like wood breaking, followed by something that looked like steps. But the steps were fast and short, as if several small people walked at the same time. I thought I was getting paranoid, but decided to pay more attention. Opened a crack in the curtain of the room and looked at his attic. The light would blink from time to time, as if someone passed in front of it, but you couldn't see any shadows. As strange as it was, my curiosity was starting to grow. I knew I should ignore and go to sleep, but I couldn't. Something in that house made me uneasy. On the third day, I couldn't stand it and decided to ask the neighbors if anyone knew anything about the man in the front house. I went to the house next door and talked to the lady who has been living there for more than 20 years. She told me that the neighbor was a recluse, that no one ever saw him, and that he lived there long before I moved. I knew what he was doing, asked why the attic light was on every night, but she just shrugged and said, "I learned not to ask questions." He never bothered anyone, and I'd rather it stay that way. That answer only increased my curiosity, but also left me with a bad feeling. Something in that story didn't make sense, and deep down I knew I should have let it go. Just not. That same night, the children grew even taller. It was impossible to ignore. It seemed like something was falling on the attic floor, and soon after, the sound of fast steps echoed again. I decided I need to see that more closely. I waited until everything on the street was quiet, took a flashlight, and went outside. My heart was racing, but something inside me said that I particularly understood what was going on at home. I walked to the edge of my sidewalk, facing his house. The light in the attic was still on, and as I looked, I swear I saw a quick movement in the window. It was as if something small and agile had run through, but could not identify what it was. That was enough for me to cross the street. When I got close to him, I felt a strange smell in the air, something metallic and heavy that seemed to come straight from the house. I looked around and noticed that all the windows were locked and the curtains closed. Only the attic remained lit. Went up the curb, trying to see better, and it was then that I noticed something that made my stomach turn, a shadow in the attic. She seemed to be standing in the center of the window, looking directly at me. No details could be seen, but it was as if someone small was there, motionless, watching me. My feet froze in place. I couldn't move for a few seconds until the shadow just disappeared. After what I saw, I ran home, closed the door, and stood in the room trying to process what had just happened. My heart was racing, and the feeling of being watched was not seeing. I knew that it had no way that shadow was my imagination. As much as I tried to rationalize, it seemed too real. I decided that I needed to do something to understand what was happening. Got my cell phone and started looking for cheap cameras or recorders that I could use to monitor his house. My idea was simple: put something special in the attic and maybe catch some strange movement during the early morning. I bought a camera the next day and installed it discreetly in my window, pointed directly to the attic of the neighbor's house. Waited for nightfall and watched the monitor. At first, nothing happened. The light of the attic was still on, but no movement. At about 2 o'clock in the morning, I heard again those sounds like fast steps and these, followed by a heavier noise like something falling. I looked at the monitor screen and my blood froze. The light in the attic started to flash, but this time I could see more clearly what was happening. The shadows were moving inside. It was not just one, they were different. Small, fast, and chaotic, as if something was running or dancing around the light. I can't take my eyes off the screen. The shadows kept moving, too fast for me to see any shape. It seemed to be surrounding the light, coming and going in a pattern that made no sense. I decided to record everything, even if it proves nothing for anyone but me. While the camera was recording, another detail caught my attention. There was something in the corner of the attic window, something that looked like a face. He was small, pale, and still, as if he were just watching me. But the worst of all was when he realized that he did not blink. At that moment, I felt a shiver coming up through my spine, and my first occurrence was turning off the camera and closing the curtains, as if it could protect me. The next morning, I took courage to watch the recordings. During the first few minutes, everything seemed normal. The light of the attic lit up, no movement. But as soon as the noises came, the shadows also appeared. I paused several times, trying to understand what it was, but it seemed impossible. I could only distinguish one thing clear. The shadows came from fixed objects, motionless during the day. Dolls. The attic was full of them, and their contours were evidently built in the projected shadows. It was then that I noticed something even more disturbing. In one of the pictures, one of the dolls seemed to have changed position. I can't explain, but she was standing at the beginning of the video, and in the end, it seemed to be sitting with her head facing the window. After seeing this, I knew I couldn't ignore it. As much as I tried to convince myself that it was a trick of light or a coincidence, that delivery was simply wrong. I decided to wait until late afternoon, when the sun was still high, to try a more direct approach. I crossed the street, rang the doorbell, and waited. Nothing. I knocked again, knocked on the door, and even tried to call the neighbor, but the silence was absolute. The house seemed completely empty, as always. Before I gave up, I noticed that the door on the side, which led to the yard, was half open. Do not know what gave me courage, but I pushed slowly and went into the yard. The feeling of crossing that fence was suffocating. The metallic smell I had felt before was stronger, and the silence was almost unbearable. I walked to the side of the house and looked up, trying to see the attic from another angle, but the curtains were closed. The only thing that caught my attention was a small window ajar, through which I could hear a low sound, constant, as if someone were mumbling or singing. My stomach turned, but I kept walking to the back door. It was locked. I did not dare to force it, but left my cell phone flashlight on, pointing inside. That's when I saw something I will never forget. Rows of dolls, meticulously organized, looking at the entrance, as if they were waiting for something or someone. I backed off at the time. I didn't have the courage to go in, but it made me more restless than ever. As I was coming home, I started to think about whether I should call the police or just forget it. But how would I explain what was happening? Oh, my neighbor has dolls in the attic and makes strange noises at night. It seemed crazy even for me. I decided that I would keep an eye on that night, just to see if something different would happen. waited until dawn, turned on the camera again, and was surprised. The noise began at the same time, but this time seemed even louder. The shadows began to move again, but something new happened. The light of the attic went out. My heart almost came out of the mouth. The light never went out. I kept looking at the screen, waiting for something, anything, but nothing happened for a few minutes. It was then that the movement started again, but this time it was not inside the attic. It was in the street. Something small and dark moves fast, passing through the shadows of the trees, coming straight towards my house. I moved away from the monitor and ran to the window, but saw nothing outside. Went back to the camera, and the movement had stopped right in front of my door. It was like something was there, standing, waiting. My instinct was to turn everything off and lock all the doors, but that night I could barely sleep. After we left the house, we sat on the floor outside, unable to say a word. Mark was panting, but he seemed to have regained consciousness. He didn't remember anything that happened in the room or office, and I decided not to tell him everything at that moment. We needed to get out of there as soon as possible. I took the car key and helped him in while looking at the house one last time. The lights were all out, but for some reason I felt that there was something, or someone, watching us from the bedroom window. We turned on the car and left without looking back, with the winding mountain road leading us back to civilization. When we arrived in the nearest town, we called the owners of the property to say that we would not return. They didn't explain the reasons, and they didn't ask. They seemed strangely conformed, as if they already knew. Since then, we never returned to that house, and I refused to search further about the place. But sometimes Mark still wakes up in the middle of the night, mumbling about the gorge and the figures in the shadows. I try to ignore it, but the truth is that since that day, I feel like something has followed us. Whenever I'm alone, I have the feeling of being watched, and on quieter nights, I swear that I still hear those heavy steps, as if they came straight from the corridor of the house. The haunted house. I moved into that house with my family in the late 1970s. It was a small, old house with a constant smell of mold and rest that ranged at every step. We didn't have much choice at the time. The rent was cheap, and my father said it was temporary, just until things got better. The neighborhood was not the best either, but there was something in the house that made me uncomfortable from the beginning. The windows were small and did not let in enough light, even on the clearest days. The kitchen was always dark, as if the house itself wanted to keep that gloom. My mother complained that the stove never heats properly, and my younger brother said his room was too cold even in summer. It seemed exaggerated at the time, but soon we began to realize that this house was different. The first few weeks were normal, but after that, small things started to happen. Objects moved without explanation. One day my mother put the key to the house on the dining table, as she always did, and minutes later it simply disappeared. We searched for hours and ended up finding the key in the kitchen, inside one of the cabinets, where no one had moved. Then there were the noises. At first, it was just these on the ceiling or floor, the kind of thing we thought it was because of the old house. But over time, the children began to seem more deliberate. Sometimes we heard something falling in the next room, but when we checked there was nothing out of place. Even my father, who never believed in any of this, began to become restless. Things started getting stranger around the third month. I remember one particular night when I was alone in the classroom, trying to finish a school lesson. My brother was already sleeping, and my parents were in their room. It was when I heard a clear sound, as if someone were walking barefoot in the corridor. The sound was slow but continuous and came towards me. When I looked, the corridor was empty. I was paralyzed for a few seconds, waiting to hear something more, but the silence came back as if nothing had happened. Ran up the stairs, and at night I slept with the light on. The next day, I did not tell anyone because I thought it was my head. But after that, the noises became more frequent and began to bother everyone. My mother started to wake up at dawn saying that she had heard footsteps in the downstairs room. Once, she even made me go down with her to check, but I didn't find anything. My father, who always said that they were only the rats, began to change attitude when the kitchen radio turned on by itself. It was one of those old radios with a turn button, and it had been off for days. Suddenly, a squeak started to sound, and no matter how much we turned the button, the sound did not stop. It was my father who took the plug from the wall and kept grumbling that we needed to throw it away. Shortly after, my mother began to realize that things in the kitchen were wrong. Pots that she was sure to have stored in the closet appeared on top of the stove. Cups that she left to dry in the colander were found on the ground, intact, as if they were placed there. One night, while she was washing the dishes, she spoke so loudly that my father and I ran to see what had happened. She was pale, pointing at the hanging dishcloth. He said that he had seen the cloth swing alone, without any wind or draft. My father tried to calm her down, saying it was in her head, but we knew it wasn't. No one spoke anything else about it that night, but the mood got heavy. The peak happened a few weeks later, when the lamp in the room fell down alone. It was not just a fall. The lamp was in the center of the table, very firm, and just fell to one side while we were all dining. I remember the sound of the glass breaking and the silence that came after, as if no one wanted to admit what he had just seen. My brother started crying, and my mother said she couldn't stand living there anymore. My father, still trying to keep calm, said it was just an accident, but I saw in his eyes that he was also starting to get scared. After that, my mother put a rosary hanging on the kitchen door, saying it didn't hurt to try. After the lampshade episode, my mother started to worry even more. She said that she felt that the house did not want us there. It seems exaggerated at the time, but something in her made me believe. That was when my grandmother, who was very religious, came to visit us. My mother told her everything, and the first thing my grandmother did was to bring a bottle of holy water. She went from room to room, praying quietly and sprinkling holy water on the walls and windows. During the day, it seemed that the atmosphere had improved. The air seemed less heavy, and even the ground creaking seemed more subtle. But that night things got worse. We were in the room, watching television, when the bathroom door, which is at the end of the corridor, slammed hard. My father asked immediately, thinking it was a draft, but all the windows were closed. He opened the bathroom door, but there was nothing there. He came back to the room, a little angry, saying we were getting paranoid. It was at this moment that the light in the room began to flash. We all stood still, looking at the ceiling, and the blink turned into an intense oscillation, as if something had happened in the matter. My father, who never believed in anything supernatural, said, "Tomorrow I will check it out." But that night no one slept properly. The next morning, my father went up to the ceiling of the house to check the wiring, as he had promised. My mother and I stayed in the room, listening to the sounds of his steps upstairs. After a few minutes, he came down with an expression I will never forget. He seemed confused and at the same time scared. said there was nothing wrong with the wiring, but that he found something strange up there. He brought down a small wooden box, all dusty, that seemed to have been left there for a long time. Inside the box was a handful of yellowed papers, a torn piece of cloth, and something that looked like an old locket. My mother did not even want to touch it. She said we should throw it away, but my father insisted that it was just a relic left by the former residents. Later that same day, we began to hear what I can only describe as whispers. They were low, almost imperceptible, and came from different corners of the house. My brother was the first to comment, saying that he thought someone was talking in the hall. At first, nobody paid attention, thinking it was his imagination. But in the evening, when we were all in the rooms, the sound became clearer. Were words indistinct, as if someone was talking but not forming complete sentences. My father went to check the corridor with a flashlight, but as always, he found nothing. He came back to the room and told us to stop freaking out, but I knew he was listening too. His expression was tense, as if he wanted to pretend that everything was fine. That same night, the noises got worse. It was not just whispers. Now it seemed that something was dragging furniture upstairs where the attic was. My father said it was impossible because the attic was too small for this, almost only an empty space between the roof and the roof. He went up to check, but came back quickly, with the face paler than I had ever seen. He said the space was completely empty, no furniture, no boxes, nothing that could be dragged. Even so, the noises continued for hours, as if someone was moving something heavy from side to side. My mother began to pray aloud, holding the rosary in her hand, while my brother cried under the blanket. That's when the doors started to slam, one by one. First the living room, then the bathroom, and finally my bedroom. The sound echoed through the house, and it seemed impossible that it was only the wind. I ran to my parents' room, where everyone was already crowded, and stood at the door, with no courage to close it. Suddenly the sound stopped. There was no more noise, as if the whole house was holding its breath. It was then that we heard a loud clap coming from the ceiling, followed by something that seemed like a whisper very close to the door of the room. My father took a candle and left it on the nightstand, saying that the light could help, but no one dared to leave the room until dawn. When the day finally came, the house looked different. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, as if something had passed through and left an invisible mark. My mother was the first to leave the room, carrying the rosary in her hand, and began to collect things for a cleaning. She said we needed to take that energy from there. My father, more practical, decided it was time to call someone to bless the house. He went after a well-known priest who arrived on the same day. The priest was a serious man of few words, but as soon as he entered the house, his expression changed. He said the house had presences, but did not want to go into details. He began to pray in every room, sprinkling holy water and asking us to repeat the prayers with him. While he was in the room, something happened that marked me forever. The candle my father had left on the night before, and that no one else had touched, simply went out by itself, as if someone had blown it. The priest stopped praying for a moment, looked at the candle and, without saying anything, continued the prayers. My mother cried softly, while my father held my brother in his lap. When the priest finished, he recommended that we leave home for a few days to give time to settle things. That same day, we went to a relative's house and never came back. My father arranged everything with a broker and handed the keys without even looking back. Even today, when I remember that house, I feel a chill in my spine. We never found out what really happened there, but I know it wasn't something of this world. The voice of the other side. When I moved to this house, I thought it would be the beginning of a new phase. I needed a quiet place, away from all the mess I was living in. The house was small but cozy with a vintage air, and had a landline phone that I honestly found a charm. Don't know why, but I decided to keep it active even if nobody used landlines anymore. The first week was quiet, with nothing out of the ordinary. I was busy unpacking boxes, adjusting furniture, and getting used to the neighborhood, which was too quiet. But on the 8th day, the phone rang for the first time. It was late at night, and I was on the couch watching TV. Thought it strange, because no one had the number of the house. I answered with a hello, half hesitant, but there was no answer. Only the breath sounds on the other side. After a few seconds, the connection dropped. I thought it was a hoax or someone called the wrong number. I didn't give much importance, but the same thing happened the next night. And the other. Always at night, around 10 p.m., the phone rang. And it was always the same, silence or heavy breathing on the other side. The 4th time, I started to get angry and said something like, "If you keep calling, I'll call the police." The call dropped immediately, but to my surprise, the next night, the pattern changed. I answered expecting the same silence, but this time a male voice spoke. "Claire." My name. It was a low voice, almost monotonous, and that froze me at the time. I hung up without thinking twice, but that feeling of being watched followed me for the rest of the night. After that call, I started to get paranoid. How did that person know my name? No one had the landline number, not even my closest friends. The next day, I discussed it with a colleague at work, who laughed and said that it was probably just a hoax. But that didn't seem like a joke to me. The night came, and the phone rang again, punctually at 10 p.m. I answered with the intention of confronting whoever it was, but the man's voice was straight. "Why did you put the blue cup on the table? You always use the red one." My body froze. I had just done it seconds before. He couldn't have known. Turned off the phone so fast I almost knocked down the device, and for the first time, locked all the windows of the house. I spent that night awake, reliving every detail of the call. How did he know what I was doing? And why? I decided I needed to investigate, so I started looking for information about the number in the few times that I had the courage to answer, and the caller ID recorded something. I called the operator, but they said it was an unknown number and that they could not track it. I started looking through the history of the house, asking the neighbors if they knew anything. Most had no information, but an older gentleman who lived on the street for decades mentioned that the house had a strange history. He said that the last residents did not stay there for long, and that one of them, many years ago, had disappeared without a trace. It made me even more uneasy. I decided I needed to know more, so I went to the city library to look for old records. After a few hours of digging through the archives, I found a newspaper article from the 1970s about a man named Richard Hale, who mysteriously disappeared. He was the former owner of the house, and the article mentioned that he had disappeared without a trace, leaving all his belongings behind. The strangest thing was that the photo of the article showed the same landline phone that was in my room. Same model, same place. A shiver ran through my spine. I started to connect the dots, but everything seemed too surreal to be true. That night, at 10 o'clock sharp, the phone rang again. I was already with my heart in my mouth when I answered. Before I said anything, the voice began to describe in detail what I was wearing. White shirt, black pants. You think it's hidden, but I can see everything. I dropped the phone on the floor and ran to check the windows, but they were all closed. Went up to the room and locked myself in there, but the feeling of being watched did not pass. I took my phone and called the police, but they said they couldn't do anything without more evidence. I knew I had to get out of that house, but something in me said that as long as he was there, he wouldn't stop. I decided that would be my last night at the house. I packed a bag with some clothes and papers and planned to leave as soon as it was light. Stayed on the couch, trying to stay awake, with all the lights of the house on. The phone was silent until 22H, when it rang again. This time I hesitated, but I knew I had to answer. I picked up the phone with my trembling hands, and before I could say anything, the voice said, "You can't run away, Claire. I've always been here." This time he wasn't describing what I was doing. He seemed to be inside the house. I heard the sound of something falling upstairs, as if a piece of furniture had been knocked down. My blood froze. I took the keys and ran to the door, but the moment I unlocked it, all the lights went out at the same time. The house was completely silent, but the phone was still working. Still holding the phone, I heard the heavy breathing on the other side of the line, closer and closer. I dropped the device and ran out to the street without looking back. I spent the night in the car, parked outside the police station, and the next morning I came back just to get the rest of my things. I never set foot in that house again. I later found out that the number on the phone belonged to Richard Hale, the man who had disappeared decades earlier. The phone was disabled shortly after his disappearance, but somehow the calls continued. To this day, I can't explain what happened, but I know that wherever Richard is, he never really left. The house with dark past. When we moved into that house, it looked like a find. My father found the ad by chance, and the price was so below market that we did not think twice. It was a big house with a kind of old look, but charming. The walls had dark wood details, the floor creaked a little, and there was a garden that my mother loved at first sight. It was the perfect place to start again, or at least that's what we thought. The first month was quiet, except for the occasional creaks that my mother said were due to the bold floor. But it was the second month that things started to seem strange. Nothing that would draw a lot of attention, but you know that feeling that something is not right? I started to feel it constantly. The first event that made me really uncomfortable happened on a Saturday afternoon. I was in the room organizing some things when I heard footsteps coming from the corridor. I thought it was my brother, but when I looked, there was no one there. I called his name, but he answered from downstairs, saying that he was in the room with my parents. I stood still for a few seconds, trying to understand what I had heard, but I ended up convincing myself that it was something in my head. Later, I commented to my mother, and she laughed, saying that the old house makes these noises anyway. I tried to let it go, but after that, I started hearing these steps almost every day, always at the same time. The weeks passed, and the noises began to become more frequent. It wasn't just steps in the hallway. Sometimes it looked like furniture was being dragged upstairs. At first, I thought it might be some neighbor doing construction, but it was impossible to ignore the fact that the sound came from inside the house. The worst was when these noises started happening during the night. My mother woke up scared, wondering if someone was walking down the hall, and my father always said it was the wind or the weight of the old house. But no one could explain how once the lamp in the corridor ended up on the floor with the broken lamp, without anyone having passed by. It was then that my brother found something that completely changed our view of the house. He was playing in the back garden when he stumbled on something hard, buried under the earth. Called my father, who dug and found an old wooden box. Inside, there were some old photographs, all in black and white, showing the interior of the house at different angles. In one of the photos, I could see the room exactly as it was now, but with a large dark spot on the floor, right where the carpet my mother had put. There was also a letter, handwritten with sloppy calligraphy, but we could only decipher one part. They know what happened here. My mother turned pale when she saw it and asked us to put everything back, but I knew something very strange was happening. After finding that box, the mood in the house changed completely. My father tried to act like it was nothing, saying that it was just old people stuff, but I realized he was as uncomfortable as we were. My mother began to avoid being alone at home, and even my brother, who was small and usually not scared of anything, started sleeping in my parents' room. But what scared me the most were the noises, which now were getting louder and more frequent. It was not just steps or moving being dragged. Sometimes I heard whispers from upstairs, words that I could not understand, but left me with the hair on my neck. That night, something happened that no one could explain. We were all in the room watching television when the lights started to blink. My father stood up to check the breaker, but before he could reach the kitchen door, the sound of something heavy falling upstairs echoed through the house. It was so high that it looked like the ceiling would collapse. We ran up, but when we opened the door of the room where the sound had come, there was nothing out of place. My father insisted it must have been an old beam or some animal in the attic, but I knew it wasn't that. The feeling of being watched was so strong that I could barely stay in that room. And for the first time, my father also did not argue when my mother suggested that we go to sleep at my aunt's house that night. The next morning, we went back to the house to get some clothes and try to understand what was happening. My mother insisted on calling an older neighbor who had lived there for decades to ask if he knew anything about the house. When Lord Roberto arrived, he seemed reluctant even to enter, stood at the door looking around, and then asked if we had found any old thing on the ground. We talked about the box my brother found, and he just shook his head, saying, "You should not have touched that." After much insistence, he told me that some 40 years ago, that house had been the scene of a horrible crime. An entire family was found dead, and no one ever found out who was responsible. He said that after that, people who tried to live there did not stay long. Strange was the word he used before saying his farewell in haste. After that conversation, the feeling of discomfort only increased. We decided to do more research on the house and went to the city hall to look at the records. It was there that we found out the details of the crime. The family had been found in the room, all around the dining table, with marks indicating a brutal attack. The strangest thing was that there were no signs of breaking in or fighting. It seemed like they were waiting for something or someone. We also found that the carpet my mother had laid on the floor of the room was exactly where the blood stains had been recorded in the investigation. My mother was shocked to hear this and said she would not go back to that house, but my father insisted there was no reason for panic. That night, we decided to go back and get the rest of our stuff. My mother did not want to go in at all, so she stayed in the car with my brother while my father and I went up. The house looked even more gloomy than before, as if the structure itself were heavy. We started to collect everything quickly, but while we were in the upstairs corridor, we heard a sound coming from the room. It was low, a drag from something on the ground. My father, trying to be brave, said it must be the wind moving something, but I could feel that he was as nervous as me. We decided to go down to check, and that's when we saw what seemed impossible. The carpet in the room, the one my mother had put on the stain, was all rolled up and thrown aside. The floor where the carpet was now looked darker, as if something was wet there. My father stood there, staring at it, not knowing what to say. Suddenly, the air in the room was cold, and a strange smell took over the place, something metallic that gave me craving at the time. It was then that we heard a sound I will never forget, a light laughter, like that of a child coming from the corridor. My father pulled me by the arm, and without a word, we ran out of the house. We locked the door as fast as we could and didn't look back. When we told my mother, she started crying, saying that she knew something was wrong from the beginning. After that day, we never went home. My father made sure to put the house up for sale as soon as possible, even if it was for a price far below what we paid. While we were still waiting for a buyer, we began to notice something even stranger. Every time we passed in front of the house to check, it seemed that the lights were on. My dad always said it must be a problem with the wiring or some short circuit, but I knew it wasn't. One night, while we were at my aunt's house, we received a call from the real estate agency saying that some people had complained of noises coming from the house as they passed by. This only confirmed what we all already knew, that house had something wrong. Finally, we got rid of the house. An investor bought the property to renovate it, but we never knew what happened after that. I just know that, even today, I have nightmares about that place. Sometimes I dream of the sound of footsteps in the corridor, other times with that low and disturbing laughter. My mother never spoke about the house again, and my father always avoids the subject, but I know he also feels the same chills when he remembers. The strange thing is that, after all this, I still think about that letter we found in the box. They know what happened here, just wondering who they were and what actually happened in that room. I don't think I will ever want to find out. The room that does not exist. When we bought that Victorian house, it seemed like a dream coming true. It was huge, full of old details, with an elegant staircase and windows that filled the rooms with natural light. Although somewhat worn by time, the structure was solid, and the sense of history it carried was irresistible. We spent the first few weeks excited, exploring every corner, taking measurements for furniture, and making plans for small renovations. It was during one of these explorations that we noticed something strange. The map of the property, which came along with the purchase paperwork, showed an extra room on the top floor. However, when we went up the stairs, there was no sign of that room. Neither doors nor windows, nothing. At first we thought it was just a mistake on the map. Maybe a room had been demolished in some old renovation. But something didn't seem to fit. The plan clearly showed a considerable space in the right corner of the house, but the corridor was straight, without detours or doors leading to this place. Curiosity began to consume us, and we decided to call an architect to check. He made measurements, hit the walls, and confirmed. There was a closed space there, as if an entire room had been hidden behind the walls. He suggested that we take down a piece of the wall to understand what was inside, and that's what we did on the same day. Taking down that wall was more work than we expected. With each hammering, a cloud of dust rose, and the sound echoed through the house, as if we were violating something that should remain untouched. When we finally opened a hole big enough to see what was on the other side, the first thing we felt was a strange smell. It was like mold mixed with something more metallic, almost like rusty iron. We pointed a flashlight inside, and saw that the space was completely empty, except for something in the center of the floor. It was a small black-covered diary, so old that it seemed to disintegrate if we touched it. The architect, visibly uncomfortable, suggested that we let the place air before touching anything, but I was already determined to enter. Carefully I took the diary and took it to the room, where we began to leaf through it. The pages were yellow and fragile, but the handwriting was surprisingly legible. It belonged to a young woman named Eleanor, and the first texts were just reports of her daily life. Simple things like household chores and family reunions. But as we went through the pages, the narrative changed. Eleanor began to describe noises at night, footsteps echoing through the corridor when everyone was already asleep. Then, she mentioned hearing whispers calling her name, always coming from inside that room. The last entry in the diary was short and poorly written, as if it had been hastily made. They come at night. I can't stay here anymore. That's when we realized she never mentioned leaving the room, as if she had been stuck there. After reading that last entry, the mood in the house changed completely. The air seems heavier, and a feeling of quite constant discomfort from us. We decided to close the room and figure out what to do the next day. But that night something strange happened. I was lying down, trying to sleep, when I heard footsteps coming from upstairs. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but the children continued, as if someone walked slowly from one side to the other. I looked to the side and saw that my wife was also awake, looking at the ceiling with wide eyes. "Are you hearing this too?" she said, in a sentence almost inaudible. Took courage and decided to go up to check. The house was in complete silence, except for the creaking floor under my feet. When I got upstairs, everything seemed normal. No sign of anything or anyone being there. I looked at the wall we had opened earlier and noticed that there was a slight scratch on the floor, just at the entrance of the space, which is unobstructed. It was as if something had been dragged by Dolly. I went back to the room and told my wife that there was nothing, but inside I was restless. I tried to ignore it and go back to sleep, but deep down I knew that something had changed in the house since we opened that room. The next morning, my wife found something that made everything even stranger. On the window sill of our room, there were finger marks, as if someone had held it there with force. The problem is that night, the windows were locked on the inside, and no one but us had access to the house. The marks were sharp, small, almost delicate, but visible enough to make us uncomfortable. We decided to take the day off to clean the whole house and try to bear out the atmosphere, as my wife suggested. But the truth is that we were trying to occupy our minds, not to think about what it wanted. While we were cleaning, I noticed that the diary was exactly where we left it the night before, on the desk in the living room. For some reason, I felt a strange urge to open it again. As I leafed through it, I noticed something that was not there before. There was a new page written, with a handwriting very similar to that of Eleanor. The words were simple, but enough for me to freeze completely. "You open the door. Now they are free." I showed it to my wife, who turned pale and said we needed to leave the house immediately. However, before we could make any decision, the lights started to blink and a loud sound, like a door slam, echoed through the house. We stood still for a few seconds, trying to understand what was winning. The bangs continued, now higher and faster, as if someone was trying to break down an invisible door. The sound came from upstairs, exactly on the side where the sealed room was. My wife started crying and begged me to leave the house, but I felt like I needed to check. I took a flashlight and started to climb the stairs while she was in the room. Each degree I climbed seemed harder, as if the air was getting heavier. When we reached the top, I realized that the wall we had discovered was completely different. There were scratches around the opening deep, as if something had tried to force itself out. Pointing a flashlight into the room, which I saw made my blood freeze. The space, which was empty before, now had a small antique furniture in the corner. It looked like a dressing table, but it was covered with dust and cobwebs. Over the dressing table was a broken mirror, and in the center of the glass a pale face appeared for a second before disappearing. I could not move. The sound of the beats stopped suddenly, and the house plunged into an almost unbearable silence. It was when I felt a cold touch on my shoulder. I did not wait to see what it was. I ran down the stairs, took my wife by the hand, and we left the house without looking back. After we ran out of the house, we were in the car, not knowing what to do. My wife was in shock, and I tried to keep calm, but my heart was still pounding. We decided to spend the night in a hotel, and thought that we would not do the next day. When we came home in the morning, the silence was almost more disturbing than the noises of the previous night. Everything seemed normal, but there was something different in the energy of the place. The diary was still on the desk in the room, but when he opened it, he noticed that all the pages were blank, as if nothing had been written there. That was enough to convince my wife that we should never come into the house again. We were able to sell the property a few weeks later, but never talked to the new owners about what happened. To this day, I don't know if it was the right thing to do, but I didn't want to carry that with me. Still thinking about those scars and face marks I saw in the broken mirror. Will we release something that should have been stuck? I have no answers, but I know that since then I feel a strange presence around me, even far from that house. Sometimes I think I hear footsteps or feel a light touch on my shoulder when I'm alone. Not sure if they are remnants of what happened or just my mind playing tricks on me. But the fact is that I never got rid of the feeling that something came out of that room, and maybe it's still around. The land of graveyard. It all started in a way that seemed harmless, but looking at it now I realized that things were wrong from the beginning. My family moved into this house about a year ago. It was a simple house in a quiet neighborhood with friendly neighbors. Among them was Dona Marta, who lived next door. She was an older woman, quiet, but always with a strange, almost heavy look. We didn't talk much, just those good days of neighbors. But my mother always said that she felt discomfort around her, something difficult to explain. Everything was quiet in the first months, until we started to find the black earth thrown in our yard near the front door. At first, we thought it was some animal or even children playing. My father cleaned up and went on with his life, but that started happening almost every week. The earth appeared in different places, on the balcony near the windows, and once even on the hood of the car. It was a kind of damp land with a strange smell, which I could not explain. My mother, suspicious, began to say that it was not normal. One day while we were cleaning, she commented softly, "I think someone is doing it on purpose." That night, my sister woke up in the middle of the morning saying she heard footsteps in the yard. My father went out to see, but found nothing. However, the next morning, there was land again, right on the doorstep. After that night, the mood in the house began to change. It was not only the land that bothered us. My mother said she felt the air heavier, as if something was constantly watching us. My father, always more skeptical, said it was paranoia, but even he seemed quieter and angrier than usual. One of the strangest things happened when we started to notice that small objects were disappearing. They were simple things like keys, cutlery, or even clothes from the clothesline. They disappeared for days and suddenly appeared in completely random places, like under the bed or in the yard. It was then that my mother decided to talk to an acquaintance of hers, a person she called spiritual things expert. This woman, after hearing the report, indicated us a certain Jonas, a scientist of the occult sciences. At first, we thought it was overkill, but we agreed to call him. He came the next afternoon, carrying some tools and a serious air that did not help our nervousness. He took a sample of the land and stood in silence for several minutes, just watching the yard. Then he turned to us and said, "This is graveyard land. Someone's using it to do a job on you." Those words made my mother start crying, and for the first time I saw my father without a vent, staring at the ground. After Jonah said that, the silence in the house was suffocating. He explained that the land of the cemetery is used in magic rituals to attract negative energy or anchor something in a place. Said that in our case it seems someone wanted to target us directly, but did not want to go into details about the reason. My mother, still crying, asked if he could do something to help. Jonas said he would do a spiritual cleansing, but we needed to find out who was behind it. It was then that he suggested observing who was watching near the yard, especially at night. My mother looked at the house of Dona Marta, and something in her look made me shiver. My mother seemed to know deep down who was behind everything. That night we decided to stay awake and alert, but nothing happened. We were exhausted, but we could not ignore what Jonah was here. The next morning, while we were again clearing the ground playing on the balcony, my mother found something in the middle of the pile. A piece of black cloth, all wrapped in a red cord. When she opened up, we saw what seemed to be a mixture of coarse salt, hair strands that looked like one. My father was furious and ran to the gate, looking at Dona Marta's house, but he did not have the courage to confront her. We decided to call Jonas again, and he warned us not to touch anything with our hands and keep everything in place until he arrived. When Jonah arrived, he stared at the piece of cloth for a long time, as if trying to decipher something. He asked us not to speak too loudly while in the yard, as if he did not want anyone to listen. After examining what my mother found, he confirmed that it was part of a job. "They're trying to hit you from the inside out," he said. "This is for bringing in fighting, disease, that sort of thing." My father, who until then was silent, said what we should do. Jonas explained that we needed to burn the fabric and things inside it, but not at home. Do it far away from here, and then take a bath with coarse salt. Don't let any of that energy come back to you. We decided to follow his advice the same day. My father took the fabric and took it to a remote site to burn it. My mother, on the other hand, seemed even more worried. She said that she did not miss that it would solve everything, that the source of the problem was still very close. That night, the noises started again. Steps in the backyard, hidden in the back door, and even the sound of something falling in the kitchen, even with everything locked. When we checked, the kitchen was empty, but the smell of the earth, that damp and heavy smell, was strong. It was as if it did not want to go away. The next morning, we found more soil scattered in the entrance of the house, but this time it had something different. In the middle of the hill, there was a black candle partially melted. My mother panicked, saying that was a sign that the work was still active. My father was even more angry and decided that we cannot ignore the situation. He went to the house of Dona Marta. Although not sure that she was behind everything, he wanted to confront her. We watched the window as he knocked on her door several times. When she finally appeared, the way she looked at him gave me a shiver. She did not seem surprised or worried, just indifferent. My father returned without saying much, but I could see that he was nervous. We decided to reinforce the security of the house that afternoon, putting extra locks and even cameras in the yard. Still, that night the noises came back, and this time they were louder. It seemed like someone was dragging something heavy through the yard. I was awake until almost 3 in the morning, with my ears open, when I heard a sound that froze me to the bones. A low, muffled laugh, as if it came from very close. I peeked out of my bedroom window, and for a moment, I swear I saw a shadow in the corner of the yard near the fence that led to Dona Marta's house. But when I blinked, there was nothing left. It was at that moment I realized that it wasn't just someone trying to scare us. It was something much more serious. The next morning, Jonah came back to check on things. When we told about the laughter and the shadow, he became serious, more serious than we have ever seen before. He told us that at that point the problem was not just the magic work, but what it had brought into the house. These things are like a magnet. When you move with energy like that, it attracts other presences, he explained. Jonas insisted that we needed a more intense spiritual cleansing and brought some items: white candles, incense, and a smoker. He asked us not to leave the house while we were doing the ritual, saying that we needed to be present so our energy could be protected. While Jonas was doing the ritual, the air inside the house seemed to change. It was as if the temperature had dropped even with all the windows closed. In the middle of smoking, we heard a loud noise coming from the yard, as if something had fallen or been knocked down hard. Jonas told us to stay inside and went there. When he came back, his face was pale. He said that he had found a pile of earth even wetter and cooler than the previous ones, and this indicated that someone had just put it there. After that cleaning, things were quiet, but we never managed to free ourselves completely from the feeling of being watched. In the following months, we moved. I don't know what happened to Dona Marta after that, but I never had the courage to go back to that house. The cult of the Red Lanterns. In my city, the Red Lantern Festival is the biggest event of the year. The streets are all lit with lanterns hanging from the facades of the houses, and the residents go out to celebrate, eating and drinking in the stalls that fill the central square. It's an old tradition, something that existed before my grandparents were born. Everyone always said that the lanterns were just a decoration, a symbol of unity of the community. But if you ask older people, they will tell another story. They say that many years ago, a cult used red lanterns to mark the houses where human sacrifices would take place. I always thought it was just an urban legend, one of those stories invented to scare the kids. At least until what happened at the last festival. It was a cold night, but the city was full of people, as always happens at the festival. I was with my friends, Jake, Amanda, and Liz, and as dumb teenagers we decided it would be fun to investigate the lantern legend. We had drunk some beers hidden, enough to feel brave. The idea was simple: follow the flashlights that looked different from the others. Amanda was the first to notice that some flashlights seemed wrong. They shone brighter, and even with the cold wind of that night, the flames did not flicker. Jake, always the skeptic, said it was just some special candle or a tech trick, but Liz and I thought it was too weird. We decided to follow the pattern of the lanterns and see where they would take us. We started walking the farthest streets, where there was less movement. The more we walked, the stranger the lanterns seemed. The houses with these bright lanterns had a strange silence, as if no one was inside. In fact, many of them seemed abandoned, with windows closed and no sound coming from inside. Amanda, who had the phone with the strongest flashlight, lit the way while Liz wrote down the addresses of the houses in her notebook. The plan was to investigate the next day and maybe even post a video about it. But that night, something changed. When we passed one of the last streets, we realized that there was a pattern in the addresses. All the houses were marked with odd numbers. Jake, still trying to seem rational, said we should go back, that it was getting bad. But Amanda insisted on going on. She pointed to a lantern at the end of the street, hanging in an old and decaying house that had seemed unoccupied for decades. This lantern was different. It didn't shine like the others. Instead, its light seemed to pulsate like a heartbeat. I can't explain why, but at that moment I felt we shouldn't get closer. It was like something told me to leave. Liz was also restless, but Amanda and Jake laughed at our reaction and said it was bullshit. They went ahead, and Liz and I followed them, even with a squeeze in the chest. When we got close to the house, the silence became even heavier. There was not even the sound of the wind, which before blew through the trees. Amanda climbed the steps of the balcony, lighting the door with her phone. The wood looked rotting, full of marks and scratches, as if someone had tried to force their way in. Jake, being the boldest, pushed the door slowly, and it opened with a long, sharp creak. The smell that came from inside was horrible, a mixture of mold, dirt, and something metallic, almost like blood. Amanda said she wasn't going to go in, but Jake laughed and came anyway, saying that there was nothing there but dust and rats. Liz and I stayed on the balcony, but Amanda, maybe to prove she wasn't scared, ended up coming in too. Inside, the house seemed frozen in time. The furniture was covered with dust, and there were pieces of newspaper scattered on the floor, dating back to the 70s. The strangest thing, however, was that some lanterns identical to those outside were hanging on the inner walls, and their flames shone exactly the same way, as if defying any logic. Liz stood at the door, calling Amanda and Jake to come back, but before they answered, we heard a sound coming from above. It was something between a moan and a snap, like wood being forced by some weight. Jake stopped laughing at the same time. Amanda looked up with the cell phone flashlight, but I couldn't see anything but the dusty ceiling. "Let's go," I said, but nobody moved. It was as if something held us there. It was then that we heard footsteps coming from upstairs. They were slow, almost dragged, but the sound was unmistakable. It was not wood squeaking, nor some animal. It was clearly someone walking. Jake, who was up to that point playing brave, started to take steps backwards, muttering something like, "Okay, it's done, let's get out of here." Amanda, on the other hand, stood still, staring at the staircase that led to the second floor, as if trying to decide whether or not to go up. Liz started pulling her arm, begging us to leave, but Amanda seemed hypnotized. Suddenly the lanterns on the wall began to flash. Not like a candle flickering in the wind, but in a rhythmic way, synchronized with the steps upstairs. Each blink seemed to mark a step. Without saying a word, we all started to retreat towards the door. It was when something heavy fell upstairs, as if a piece of furniture had been thrown on the floor. The sound was so loud that it made the windows of the house vibrate. Liz screamed, and Amanda finally came to her senses, running out with Jake. I was the last to leave, but before crossing the door, I looked back for an impulse that I still cannot explain. It was then that I saw the shadow. She was at the top of the stairs, high and still, as if she were watching us. It had no face, no definite shape, but the weight of it made me freeze for a second. When we finally left, the lanterns on the balcony were out, even those that before seemed impossible to erase. We run down the street without looking back, the silence of the house now replaced by the sound of our panting breaths and hasty steps on the asphalt. When we finally stopped, a few blocks away, Amanda started crying. Jake tried to calm her down, but even he was shaking. Liz was pale, holding my arm so hard I thought it would leave marks. We tried to understand what had happened, but no one could explain. Jake, still trying to be rational, said there must be someone living in the house, maybe a homeless person or some crazy person. But Amanda and I knew it wasn't. That shadow at the top of the ladder was not human. When we returned home, the festival was still happening normally. The streets were full of people, and no one seemed to notice that something strange had happened. That night I tried to sleep, but I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the flashlights flashing and heard those steps. The next morning, Liz called me. She said that she was reviewing the addresses she wrote down and noticed something terrifying. All the houses marked by the strange lanterns had residents who have disappeared in recent years, and no one ever commented on it. The idea that this cult still existed, and that the festival was just a front for something much darker, left me cold. I never went back to the festival, and until today, I can't look at a red lantern without feeling that something, or someone, is still there watching. I always lived in a quiet street, one where all the neighbors know each other by name and spend their lives exchanging conversations on the sidewalk. It was the kind of place where you could leave children playing outside without worry. But that changed when cats started disappearing. It all started slowly, with one or two animals disappearing from time to time. At first, people found out they were running away, or something had happened by accident. Mas paucos meses, pericia que ninguém mais conseguia manter gato na rua. O padrão cômico a ficar óbvio. Todos os animais desaparecidos eram vistos pela última vez perto de uma casa velha e abandonados no final da rua. Uma casa que, na verdade, ninguém sabia muito sobre. Decidi investigar quando meu próprio gato, Max, desapareceu. Ele era caseiro, mas adorava passear pelo quintal e, às vezes, escapava para explorar. Na noite anterior, ele não voltou, e eu sabia que algo estava errado. Conversei com alguns vizinhos, e descobri que outros estavam tão desconfiados quanto eu. Amanda, uma senhora que mora há mais de 20 anos na rua, diz que já tinha visto vários gatos entrando no quintal daquela casa, mas nunca saindo. Johnny e minha outros dois vizinhos, e decidimos ir lá naquela mesma tarde. Era dia nublado, e o clima parecia combinar com o que estávamos prestes a fazer. Peguei uma lanterna, mesmo como o sol ainda forte, e fomos direto à casa que sempre evitamos olhar por muito tempo. Quando chegamos ao portão enferrujado da casa, o lugar parecia ainda mais assustador do que eu lembrava. O quintal estava coberto de mato alto, e os galhos das árvores formavam sombras que quase escondiam a fachada. A casa tinha janelas quebradas, a tinta descascada em grandes pedaços, e a porta de frente parecia estar segura por fio. Cairo estranho parava no ar, algo entre padredeo e mofo. Amanda fica no portão, dizendo que não tinha coragem de entrar, Mas eos outros dois relacionamentos continuaram. Abrimos caminho pelo mato e chegarmos ao quintal, que parecia ainda mais sinistro de perto. Lá, encontrei algo que fez meu estômago revirar. Pequenas pilas de ossos espalhadas pelo chão, algumas cobertas de pelo que pareciam de gato. My heart popped. I took a flashlight, even though it was still daylight, and began to examine the place more closely. The feeling of being observed was intense, as if the house itself was watching us. One of the neighbors, Carlos, found a small cellar door in the high bush. She was locked with a padlock, but beside her there was something even more disturbing, an old bowl full of rotten food. Amanda, who had stayed at the gate, began to shout that she heard something coming from inside the house. Carlos tried to force open the lock, but the sound from inside made us stop. It was a meow, but it didn't seem normal. It was low, husky, almost like a moan. We stood still, not knowing if we would open that door or run from there. Carlos insisted on trying to open the lock, but with each attempt, the meow got stranger. It was as if he was coming from several places at the same time, echoing through the basement and climbing up the walls of the house. Amanda started begging us to leave, but something in me couldn't get out of there. I would like to know if Max was there, if there was any chance of finding him. I took a stone and started to help Carlos try to break the lock. After a few minutes of effort, he finally gave in. The basement door opened slowly, revealing an almost solid darkness, as if the place swallowed the little light that came in from outside. An unbearable smell came out of there, making me almost vomit. Carlos lit the basement with his lantern, revealing wooden steps that descended into a space that seemed much larger than we imagined. In the background, there were several stacked cages, all rusty, and inside them, we saw something I will never forget. Some cats, thin to the point of appearing only skin and bone, were lying motionless, as if they had already given up fighting. But what really scared me was the one in the corner of the basement. There was a small figure, curved, with something that looked like a dark robe covering his body. You couldn't see his face, but he was slightly something. He looked like a cat. When Carlos presented the light directly to it, the figure moved with a speed that did not seem human, disappearing in the darkness of the basement. We stood still for a few seconds, not knowing what to do. The silence in the basement was even more disturbing than the previous meows. Carlos was shaking and said he wasn't going down, but I couldn't get out of there without at least trying to save the cats we saw. I took his flashlight and started to go down the steps, with my heart pounding and a knot in my throat. The smell was unbearable, and the steps were so creaking that they seemed to be breaking at any moment. When I got to the bottom, I realized that the place was bigger than it looked from the entrance. The walls were covered with deep darkness and some dark spots that preferred not to identify. The cages were near me now, and the cats that were alive were left in shock, their eyes fixed on the void. I called for Max, but all I heard was that the same low sound, almost like a moan, coming from some dark corner. That's when I realized that the figure we saw before was there, in the background, standing still. My flashlight started to fail, blinking as if the battery was running out, even though it had been installed the day before. When the light stabilized, a figure moved. Now she was closer, with her back to me, but what I saw made my blood cold. Her skin looked wrong, as if it was cracked or sewn in some points. Don't wait to see more. I ran back up the stairs, shouting for others to get out of there as fast as possible. Went up the stairs so fast that it almost fell. When I arrived at the entrance of the basement, Amanda and Carlos were already outside, called me desperately, ran out, squeezing my legs tremble, and closed the door with all my strength. Don't know if it was just the adrenaline, but I swear I heard something climbing the steps behind me as I closed. We yelled for Amanda to call the police, but she was so terrified that she could barely dismiss it on the phone. We ran away from the house and only stopped when we were back at the rusty gate. We stood there waiting, looking at the house, but nothing else happened. The place was quiet, as if everything we saw had been a nightmare. When the police arrived, we tried to explain what we saw. They entered the house and searched the basement, but according to the report, they did not find any figure or the same traces of what we described. The cages were empty, and the door to the cellar, which we had broken into, was closed and intact, as if it had never been opened. The strangest thing was that, in the following days, some cats started to appear on the street again, thin and disoriented but alive. Max never came back. To this day, we avoided going near that house, and no one else dared to investigate what really happened there. But sometimes at night, I swear I still hear that low, husky meow coming from somewhere far away. The gorge and the mountain house. When we moved into that house, it seemed like we had finally found the perfect place. It was secluded, surrounded by dense forest, and offered a breathtaking view of the gorge. For me, Emily, it was like a creative retreat. Mark, on the other hand, was excited about the peace that could help him finish his book. At first, everything seemed magical. The mornings were filled with the singing of birds and the smell of fresh coffee, while the nights were quiet, with only the sound of the wind passing through the trees. But as we set out, I started to feel something strange, something I couldn't explain. It was like the whole place was aware. I remember the first sign that something was wrong. I had decided to explore the area around the house, especially the edge of the gorge, which looked so imposing from afar. As I walked, I felt that I was being watched. At first, I thought it was just paranoia for being alone in the bush, but that feeling of not passing. When I got close to the edge, I noticed something on the ground, strange marks, as if someone had dragged something heavy into the gorge. I bent down to look closer, but a strong wind made me come back. It was as if the wind had come from the bottom of the gorge, not from above, which was completely illogical. I came home as fast as I could, but I didn't tell Mark anything that night. That night, Mark looked strange. He was sitting at the desk with his laptop open, but he wasn't writing. I just looked at the screen with an empty expression, as if I was lost somewhere far away. I asked him if he was okay, and he said he had a very vivid dream the night before, something about figures coming out of the gorge and telling stories that he couldn't fully remember. I thought it was curious, but I let it go, thinking that it was just a reflection of the stress of trying to write. After dinner, he said he would try to work in the office and stayed there until late at night. I went to sleep, but woke up around 3 in the morning with a feeling that something was wrong. I got up and went to the office to see if Mark was still there. When I came in, he was sitting but seemed apathetic, looking at the screen again. The light of the lantern was on, pointed at a wall where something was written. It was a phrase repeated, almost like a mantra. They must not be released. I was paralyzed. I asked what I did, but he didn't seem to listen. It was like he was in a trance. I had to shake him to bring him back, and when he finally looked at me, he seemed confused, as if he didn't know what he was doing there. We decided to go to bed, but I knew that something was starting to change the house, and not for the better. The next morning, The tension between us was palpable. Mark could not remember having written on the wall and insisted that he had perhaps been dreaming awake. I wiped the words with a wet cloth while drinking coffee, but the feeling of discomfort did not leave me. I decided that I will clear my doubts about the gorge. I took a backpack with some items and decided to explore again, this time going deeper into the forest, towards the entrance of the sealed cave that we saw in the first days. The walk was long and increasingly silent, as if even the children of the forest had disappeared. When I finally got to the cave, I realized something was wrong. The marks of risk are not concrete that washed at the entrance unexpectedly fresh, as if someone had tried to open it recently. As I investigated more closely, I heard a low and continuous sound like a suggestion coming from inside the cave. Put my ear to the concrete, trying to understand, but all I could capture were indistinct words mixed with a strange echo. The wind started to blow stronger, but again it was coming from the gorge, not the forest. It was as if something was trying to push me away. I came home with my legs shaking, and when I walked in, I saw Mark standing in the room, looking out of the window with a look that I had never seen before. He pointed to the pass and said, in an almost monotonous tone, "They want me to write." I was paralyzed for a few seconds. The way Mark spoke those words, as if they were not his own, made me panic. I asked what he was talking about, but he just shook his head as if he had come out of a trance and said he needed some time to process everything. He went up to the office and locked himself there for the rest of the afternoon. Meanwhile, I decided to clean the house, trying to distract myself. It was when I found something that it should not be there. An old book, dusty, in the bottom of a drawer in the room. I knew we had not done that to us. The cover was worn, and when you opened it, you realized that it was a kind of diary with entries dated decades ago. The first pages talk about the construction of the house and how it was a perfect refuge for the family that lived there. But as the entries moved forward, the tone changed. One of the children of the couple who lived there began to talk about voices that he heard in the gorge, who called him by name and told secrets that he had never revealed to anyone. On the last page, there was a single phrase scribbled in haste: "They are coming, and we cannot stop them." I closed the book with trembling hands and ran to show Mark. But when I opened the door of the office, I found him with his hands on his head, mumbling something that I could not understand. On the ground, there were several leaves spread out, all with the same design, figures coming from the shadows of the gorge. I looked at the drawings on the floor, trying to understand what was happening. All the figures seemed human, but there was something wrong with them. The arms were disproportionately long, the faces were deformed, and the eyes were just empty holes. I asked Mark if he had done that, but he didn't answer. Instead, he just kept on mumbling something that when I listened more closely, I realized was repetitive. "They just want a story. They just want a story." My heart started to shoot. I took the diary that I had found and put it in front of him, asking if it had anything to do with the drawings. Mark finally looked at me, but he seemed distant, as if it were not him there. "It's the same story," he said, almost whispering, before passing out in the chair. I panicked and tried to wake him up, but he was soft, with shallow breathing. I called for help, but while waiting, something caught my attention. The diary was open, and the words were changing themselves. I thought I was going crazy, but there was no doubt the text was changing. New words appeared on the paper, as if they were written by an invisible hand. Now they were talking about a couple, describing in exact detail our arrival at the house, and what we had done in the last few days. The last sentence made me drop the book on the floor. If you continue, it will be theirs. I looked at Mark, still unconscious, and decided that we could not stay there anymore. Took the phone, and before I had even finished the call, I heard something downstairs. It was the sound of the front door opening. The sound of the door opening left me frozen. I knew that it locked before climbing, so it didn't make sense. With the phone still in hand, I went down the stairs slowly, trying to control the panic. Each step rattled, and the silence downstairs was almost deafening. When I reached the end of the stairs, I noticed that the front door was ajar open, swaying slightly as if someone had just left. I ran to close it and lock it again, but then I noticed something even worse. There were footprints on the floor. They were damp, as if someone had walked with wet feet through the room, coming straight from the canyon. The trail led to the dining table, where another thing was waiting for me. The diary, opened on the last page. The words had changed once more. Now they were written in a hasty and irregular calligraphy. You have set them free. Before I could react, I heard footsteps in the upstairs, heavy and firm, as if someone was walking down the hall. I looked up the stairs and felt a chill running through my spine. I knew Mark was still up there, but the steps were too fast to be him. Took a knife in the kitchen, shaking so much that I could barely hold it, and went up the stairs. When I got to the hallway, I saw the office door completely open, something I was sure had left closed. "Mark?" I called, but no one answered. The only thing I heard was a low, drawn breath coming from the room, as if something was waiting for me. With the knife still in my hands, I gathered all the courage I had and went towards the room. Each step seemed like a monumental effort, and the air around me was so heavy that it was hard to breathe. When I arrived at the door, I stopped, trying to hear any sound that would help me understand what was happening. The breath was still there low, but now it seemed closer. I pushed the door slowly, hoping to find Mark. Instead, I saw something that made me freeze. In the corner of the room, near the window that looked out onto the cliff, there was a tall, deformed shadow. It was not a person. Its contours were wrong, as if someone had stretched a human figure until it lost any normal proportion. The eyes, two black holes, seemed to face me directly, even without light. My first reaction was to scream, but no sound came out. The shadow began to move slowly towards me, and the whole room seemed to vibrate with her presence. It was then that I heard Mark's voice, but it didn't seem to come from his body. "Emily, they just want a story," he said, with a tone that mixed despair and resignation. At that moment I realized I could do nothing there. I ran to the office where he was unconscious and started pulling him out of the house. Each second seemed like an eternity. When we finally reached the front door, I felt something pulling my hair hard, as if the whole house was trying to hold us. It was only after we crossed the threshold that everything stopped. Silence returned, heavy, as if nothing had happened. After we left the house, we sat on the floor outside, unable to say a word. Mark was panting, but he seemed to have regained consciousness. He didn't remember anything that happened in the room or office, and I decided not to tell him everything at that moment. We needed to get out of there as soon as possible. I took the car key and helped him in, while looking at the house one last time. The lights were all out, but for some reason I felt that there was something, or someone, watching us from the bedroom window. We turned on the car and left without looking back, with the winding road of the mountain leading us back to civilization. When we arrived in the nearest town, we called the owners of the property to say that we would not return. They didn't explain the reasons, and they didn't ask. They seemed strangely conformed, as if they already knew. Since then, we never returned to that house, and I refused to search further about the place. But sometimes Mark still wakes up in the middle of the night, mumbling about the gorge and the figures in the shadows. I try to ignore it, but the truth is that since that day, I feel like something has followed us. Whenever I'm alone, I have the feeling of being watched, and in quieter nights, I swear that I still hear those heavy steps, as if they came straight from the corridor of the house.